Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Snomid International Snomid CT Research Webinar. I'm Susie Roy, the host of these webinars. At Snomid International, I am the Customer Relations Manager for the Americas, Collaborations Specialist, and Research Engagement Lead. And I am very happy to welcome you all to this month's webinar. As usual for our web series, you'll notice that everyone is currently muted. All of the microphones have been disabled at the present time. However, as we go on, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A box. At the end of today's presentation, we will have some time for some Q&A and some discussion. Today's presentation is being recorded. And as always, we will be posting the recording on the Snomid International YouTube. In addition to the Snomid CT research webinars, we do have clinical and implementation webinars. You can find all of these are past recordings as well as upcoming events on snomed.org/web-series. And I really hope that you guys are able to check those out. And as I alluded to, we do have a Snomid International YouTube channel where we post all of these clinical, implementation, and research webinars, as well as other Snomid CT related videos. I encourage all of you to go ahead and subscribe to the Snomid International YouTube channel. And I also like to always remind everyone that if you'd like to be notified of upcoming Snomid CT related research related news, I can get you on our Snomid CT research reference group. And so this is kind of a push notification listserv where I usually just post once or twice a month about upcoming research related news, some information about our expo, and other exciting Snomid CT research information. So to join that list, you just have to email me, Susie, SRO@snomed.org, and I'll get you on that list. Some more exciting news is that our registration for our Snomid Ct Expo 2022 is currently going on. So early bird registration ends on July 29th. So you have exactly 1 month from now to join at the early bird registration costings. We do hope that you are able to join us in person in Portugal, but just to let you know that this will be a hybrid event. So if you are unable to join in person for any reason, you can also join us via online, where some of our sessions will be streamed during the event. Some exciting things that are happening in that just to kind of cue you on, we will have a brand new research and innovation stream. So we'll be able to highlight some of our past and hopefully future Snomid CT research presenters in that stream. And also we will be having a pre-conference, a research-related pre-conference on that Wednesday right before the expo. And so the agenda for that is forthcoming, and I'm really excited and hope to see you all there. Okay, and so now for the main event. So Dr. Stefan Schulz is a professor of medical informatics at the Medical University of Graz, Austria. He is trained as a physician, and his research encompasses electronic health records, medical language processing, biomedical terminologies, and the application of formal ontologies for biomedical knowledge representation. He has contributed to the development of clinical terminology standards such as the WHO classifications as well as Snomid CT. And he is currently a highly regarded member of our modeling advisory group. Thank you so much, Stefan, for that, and German translation group. Dr. Schulz has a role of head of medical research projects at Averbis, a German language engineering company. And today he will be presenting, is Snomid CT an appropriate reference terminology for mining electronic health records. With that, Stefan, I will stop sharing and give you the screen.
Okay, so do you see, hello everybody, and welcome to my webinar. And I have to confess to you that I have worked on my slides for the last 5 hours, and 10 minutes ago, I found out that all the slides were gone, and I had no idea what happened. This is the first time in my life that something like that happens. So I think instead of canceling this webinar, I just take it as a challenge to convey what I want to tell you using an old slide deck. Some slides are in German, and also I would like to encourage you to also ask questions to me. Yeah, so I hope that nevertheless you will benefit from this webinar. Perhaps we can also switch to the Q&A session a bit earlier. And so I really apologize that this really happens, and we will make the best out of it. So can you see my my first slide, and can you also see my browser here, the Snomid browser?
Not yet, still seeing your photo up. Let's see.
Okay, so I have to, well, so let me just, yeah, okay, so I have to, yeah, so.
Something's starting up and
yeah.
see your slides, yes.
Yeah,
perfect.
Okay, so I hope I can at least partly solve that very, very strange problem. I knew that there was something up with our cloud system, which was not really syncing, but what happened, it's really very, very strange. So I won't lose my time, and at least the first slides are more or less the ones I wanted to show anyway. And so the question of the main question is Snomed Ct an appropriate reference terminology for mining electronic health records? And sorry, and here sorry. I think I will mostly do it without slides. So it's really, it never happened to me. So yeah, so the problem is that clinical narratives are very, very different from normal texts. And what has been done so far in terms of bringing the field of medicine and NLP, natural language processing, together has mostly been about medical texts which were published texts, so texts which were extracted from medical publications. And there are two major differences between medical texts or biomedical texts, such as, for instance, Medline abstracts on the one hand, and clinical texts as produced in the hospital. And the two differences are that, first of all, normally the clinical narratives are in the language of communication, the local language, whereas clinical or medical publications are mostly in English. And the other thing is that it takes a long time to produce medical publication. It goes to many rounds of review and revision, etc., so that the language is extremely refined, and it normally follows all rules of spelling and grammar. Whereas if you look into clinical texts, then what happens is that these texts are normally very hastily written, and full of short forms, grammar errors, and are especially extremely brief. And this is the real challenge of clinical text mining. So that having said this, the question is now, what should I tell you now about SNOMED in this scenario? Natural language processing has so many facets that it would fill a whole series of seminars. So I will be extremely focused, which means that I won't give you much information about techniques, use cases, etc. of clinical text mining, but I want to find an answer to the question: is Snomid Ct really appropriate for that? And are there certain advantages of Snomid Ct which make it a preferred resource for text mining? And what I'm focusing on is, first of all, what I understand by text understanding. So what does text understanding mean? Text understanding means that a machine is able to interpret human written text in all its facets in a way that it extracts all the important pieces of knowledge which is therein. So ideally, once you define a target representation, such as, for instance, file resources with terminology bindings to Snomid Ct, then a text understanding system should be able to instantiate such a file resource. Ideally, in a way that at the end of the day, what is in the file model looks the same, regardless of whether it has been entered via structured data acquisition or whether it comes from a text mining system. Of course, what also is very important is data provenance. So anyway, we would not lose information that has been entered by or that has been produced by text mining system. Let me just see whether I find something. Yeah, perhaps just here a short view on all those complicated phenomena which you find in clinical texts. Yeah, so it's very common that you have incomplete sentences. Yeah, there are lots of colloquialisms like pothole sign, and those colloquialisms often depend on the region, on the clinical specialty, also on the professional group. So nurses have other expressions than doctors and so on. We have ambiguous short forms like RTA, for instance, could be road traffic accident or renal tubular acidosis. And often there are short forms of local scope. Sometimes they also has another meaning, like many of these short forms. For instance, let's say RA could be rheumatoid arthritis, or it could be also right atrium, and so on. Then in some places, especially in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin is still very common. And then as a direct consequence of the quick language production, we also find lots of spelling errors and typos. This also happens naturally with people who have to write in a second language and not in their own, something which is very common in Europe, for instance. Yeah, and then we have single noun compounds in some languages, for instance, in German, that you just glue words together which are not found in any lexicon. Yeah, and then there is one thing which is very interesting, and I really created a very nice example. Unfortunately, I lost it together with the whole slide deck, but perhaps here I can reconstruct it. It is what is called an aphra. Yeah, and so imagine you have, as a human, you have to understand this text. Adenocarcinoma rect, etc., TLM, something very cryptic. And then after that, tumor excised in toto. So tumor, of course, is a very, very unspecific term. And so if we have, let's say, a naive way of text annotation, then it would not very helpful, because it wouldn't be clear which tumor is excised. And so a text understanding system should also be able to identify that this tumor refers back to the adenocarcinoma, which has been introduced before. Another example I had is, for instance, the wall of the duodenum is thickened. Yeah, and then new sentence, suspected ulcer. Yeah, you know that ulcers can be everywhere from the eye to the foot. But in this case, everybody understands, if we say there's a suspected ulcer, it's of course an ulcer of the duodenum and not an ulcer of the foot. Exactly before, because duodenum just came before in the discourse. So, and this is a very, very typical phenomenon in clinical texts. And the question is whether SNOMED brings particular resources which help resolve something like that. Well, there are other things like negations. Well, there are lots of language models that that identify negations in several languages, but nevertheless, sometimes the way how negations are expressed in clinical text is particularly intricate. Yeah, and then we have epistemic context, temporal context. I don't go deeply into that, but it's what I mean is that just a very, very short word like DD for differential diagnosis or something like that, or family history, modifies the meaning completely. Okay, so let's come back to SNOMED, and normally I divide SNOMED, I like to divide SNOMED in a terminology part, which is mostly what you find in the description table, and in an ontology part. And the ontology part is really all the knowledge which is in SNOMED. And if you want to look how the terminology part of SNOMED could be helpful for text understanding, then I often give an example, which perhaps I find here, otherwise, well, I will just tell you. Yeah, sorry, this is really a mess. Sorry, let's just stick here and not losing any more time. So my favorite example is that there's a concept which means primary malignant, a secondary malignant carcinoma of the liver. And if you, for instance, Google for that expression, the only thing you find is SNOMED. Yeah, that means that no medical or clinical writer has ever used this complicated formulation. So they normally call it liver metastasis. And in my language, it's even more extreme because we use the word metastasis, we use the word philia, we abbreviate it in many cases, etc. Yeah, and that means that normally what comes with the SNOMED releases, as good the conceptual coverage of SNOMED is, that means the fine-grained representation of the entirety of the clinical health record. The incomplete is the term coverage, which means the way and the extent how the real clinical jargon terms are really represented. And this is a very important thing. If you take the English descriptions from the international version, you still have, I think, 2.5 or so terms per concept, and you have a lot of really clinical terms. But if you take other versions, for instance, the Swedish version, you have only one term for this concept, which is then also just in Swedish, secondary malignant carcinoma of the liver. And this again in Swedish you don't find in any Swedish record, I assume, unless somebody just copies and pastes it from SNOMED itself. So, and this shows that for getting a high coverage of clinical terminology, what you really need is what is called an interface terminology, which means a representation of the language, the jargon expressions, the abbreviations clinicians really use in practice. Yeah? Otherwise, it would not be a good resource for whatsoever NLP task, because it would not just identify the terms. Yeah? Two important NLP tasks you should know is named entity recognition and named entity normalization. Named entity recognition means the NLP system identifies spans of texts and tags it with very general categories like procedure, substance, person, and so on. And named entity normalization means that then these spans already identified as something cohesive are then mapped to an ontology, yeah, via a lexicon, via a terminology. And therefore, especially because the clinical jargon is so special, you need to fill this gap by collecting clinical terms and linking them to Snomid Ct. And this is a quite expensive and time-consuming job. So I started 7 years ago doing this for the German language, and also we use a lot of also machine algorithms that produce permutations and all combinations of words in order to create a broad variety of possible interface terms, but it's far from being complete. But nevertheless, we checked it against a parallel corpus which had been annotated with Snomid Ct concepts, and this showed us a comparable outcome compared to English. So it shows that even with a quite complicated language, with all those long words like you see here, ibuprofen, intoxication as one word, which by the way is automatically created by our production line for interface terms, but it's really far from being complete. So this is let's say the terminology layer, And here it's very clear you need to add lots of the real terms clinicians use, which are not in SNOMED. And then you also have to find ways for fuzzy matching, so in a way that you also find closely related word. And this is, of course, something which is very fancy currently in the use of language models and embedding spaces, so that if you have two misspellings in a word, or perhaps there comes something in between, yeah, or you have diabetes type 2, but you have diabetes type 2 in the terminology, and diabetes Roman 2 with a typo in diabetes, that it's recognized as very, very close to the vector representation of the official term. So this is really the job of language engineering, of machine learning, and it requires a huge amount of training data. I will come to the problem of training data later, but let me now go to the ontology part, and let's think about what may be the ontological underpinning of SNOMED could contribute for text understanding. So let me just, I try to explain this. Yeah, here just, you see my browser? I think so. Yeah, and let's go back to this example. The duodenal mucosa is thickened, so there is a suspected ulcer. Yeah, and of course, if our NLP system then annotates the word ulcer, yeah, here with just this concept, ulcer disorder, it's not not very good, because we want to have a system which recognizes that beforehand it already introduced the word duodenum, yeah, and so we want to have duodenal ulcer. But if you look how duodenal ulcer is represented, then of course we find that in SNOMED there is a link between ulcer of duodenum and duodenal structure. So imagine the sequence of words from left to right. You have something like duodenum, which can be recognized as referring to duodenal structure. And then you have in the background this representation. So it's like a kind of frame-like, let's say, slot filling. Yeah, you see there is already something with the slot finding site, the finding site filled by duodenal structure, and duodenal structure has already been instantiated. Yeah, and there is this relation finding site. Yeah, and this brings us to another NLP task, which is called relation extraction. And relation extraction systems, once they have been trained by enough annotated corpora resources, already are quite likely to identify that ulcer is of the type condition, and that duodenum is of the type anatomy. And just because this pattern is so often, it has learned already that it's very likely to have a link between ulcer and duodenum. So, and then if the relation extraction system already has instantiated this link, yeah, then it gives additional support that it's very likely that in the semantic representation of this piece of discourse, yeah, duodenum thickened or wall of duodenum thickened, possible ulcer, yeah, that then this link has been asserted, this relation has been asserted, and then therefore ulcer disorder can be refined to ulcer of duodenum disorder. And this is, let's say, a reasoning service which can be supported by, for instance, description logic reasoning, but it can also be supported by certain graph operations and relatively simple heuristics. So this is a reasoning service which is not provided by other terminologies. Yeah? This link between disorder and procedure concepts in SNOMED and anatomy concepts, this is really very particular for SNOMED, and this is probably of a very high value for using SNOMED in NLP system. I do not have evidence that this really has been done, but I'm currently together with a group of students creating some reference annotations, and we then will try how also let's say a model with automatic relation extraction, but also some simple heuristics which just looks back and grabs the first anatomy concept at the left-hand side, such as in this case duodenum, helps refining the understanding of the text. So another important thing, and which is particularly important in clinical discourse, because you have so many short forms, and short forms are very ambiguous. Yeah? And the example I had prepared for you was, for instance, the example LT due to PBC, yeah, and you find things like that. So LT means liver transplant due to cirrhosis, yeah, liver cirrhosis. Just trying to remember the acronym. Yeah, and LT also. Yeah, in SNOMED you find this, or also in terminologies related to the SNOMED, you find this aberration several times, for instance, for Leishmania tropica, which is an organism. Yeah? But if you have something like LT, which refers to the liver, and then you have the disease, namely the liver cirrhosis, yeah, which also refers to the liver, that creates a path or two paths which point to the same node in the middle. And you can use that in order to select liver transplant instead of Leishmania tropica. Yeah. And this again is something which should be supported by the internal wiring of Snomid CT. Of course, you could think that, well, if you have enough training data, you can also do this by an embedding space, but you have to create this embedding space. And the embedding space has to represent really the clinical domain. And then what I already mentioned, then you have the big problem that you have to use clinical data for training. Yeah? And often you just cannot do this because you are not allowed to use this data, or you first have to de-identify it, and so on. And once you have done it perhaps for your institution, you then want to share it with another one, but according to ethical and legal requirements, you are not allowed to. At least in Europe, it's very strict. And well, to what extent you can really reverse engineer the content of a neural model is, well, it's open to debate. Yeah, and this means that some of those, let's say, well, conceptual connection between different reference of your clinical text, you can resolve within SNOMED, and you should, and this could really be a line of research which could be very interesting. You can also bring the whole SNOMED into an embedding space, or you can create a knowledge graph of SNOMED and the instances let's say of the reference which you identify when analyzing the text, and then use the mechanism of link prediction. If you do first the analysis, NLP analysis, so that you have only, let's say, de-identified data extracts, then it's perhaps less problematic to train and to share a model with clinical data. Yeah, this brings me to well, to the huge field of creating language models and the need to create resources for language models. And one important resource is the annotation of a corpus. That means that not only you should, well, you can do it for certain purposes, for instance, also for word sense disambiguation, it also may help, but for many other purposes, you need domain experts who read that corpus and annotate this corpus, for instance, with concepts or categories and relations. Yeah? And there is a huge deficit of such models in most countries. In the US, we have the MIMIC3 data set, which is very helpful. It has sparked a lot of research on clinical text mining. But if I look into the MIMIC data, I'm surprised how nicely they are written. If I compare them with our data here in Austria, it's not comparable. So documentation cultures are very different, and unfortunately, in many places, the documents really do not look nicely. Yeah, and when you start creating such annotations, then you have the problem that sometimes you find more than one concept what really fits. For instance, an extreme case, yeah, in an annotation experiment we did when analyzing or when annotating ophthalmology text, we had, for instance, this term palpebral fissure. Yeah, and then we really found 4 different concepts. Yeah, we find a palpable fissure observable. We found palpebral fissure finding. We found the body part, palpebral fissure structure, and entire palpebral fissure. And well, of course, this creates a lot of complication. And this is, and therefore, you need to be very principled when you annotate. That means you have to create annotation guidelines. For instance, annotation guidelines that tell you only use an observable concept if it is related to a value, because an observable without a value is of no use. Yeah, or if you have to choose between a finding disorder concept and a morphology concept, such as, for instance, lymphoma morphological abnormality versus lymphoma disorder, then take the disorder concept. And so we have really already filled pages and pages of annotation guidelines. And these are really necessary because in a previous annotation experiment where we had a lot of domain experts, also experienced with SNOMED and already trained and provided with some guidelines, we had them annotate snippets of clinical narratives in several languages, and we only found an inter-annotator agreement of 40%, which is really not good. We compared it with an annotation experiment where we took, to compare with SNOMED CT, an extract of UMLS without SNOMED, yeah, and it was the same. Yeah, and so we should hope that SNOMED provides structure which provides more guidance to human annotators, but this unfortunately has not been the case. So that means we need annotation guidelines, and we have to really come up with a kind of canonical way to annotate clinical narratives with SNOMED CT. And this does not stop with SNOMED CT, because as you know, along with SNOMED CT, what has become very popular is FHIR, and there are many things which are better to represent in FHIR than in SNOMED CT. For instance, everything which is context. Yeah, so perhaps you have read once a very good paper written by Raul Kumar and Alan Rector, I think 12 years ago, where they introduced the two aspects of clinical documentation, namely model of meaning, which is the terminology, and model of use, which is the information model. At that time, it wasn't FHIR, it was HL7 version 3. And since then, there has been a huge effort called Terminfo in order to draw a consistent boundary between HL7 version 3 and SNOMED in order to provide good guidance, which standard you should use for which kind of representation. Unfortunately, there hasn't been much or not at all any follow up to this with FHIR, and so it would be very important perhaps really to come back to that impressive work and to adapt it to FHIR and to provide clear guidelines for which we should use FHIR and for which we should use SNOMED. For instance, that if we have something like suspected asthma, we do not use a code suspected asthma, which is in SNOMED actually, or we could pre-coordinate in SNOMED suspected with everything. But instead of doing that, at least the way I go is I try to express all these in FHIR, where we have, for instance, a FHIR resource condition, where we have something like verification status, where we find something like provisional, so that this is used for expressing uncertainty, or also temporal aspects, or something like family history. Yeah? That this is, in my point of view, not really the job of terminology. Of course, it is possible in SNOMED because it was done with the idea that you should be able to do the maximum you want to do just using SNOMED without anything else. But perhaps now the situation is different because of FHIR, which has been extremely popular. So I just want to finish this talk also with some shortcomings in SNOMED. One of them, I would say it's really seriously for annotators, is that some or many concepts are very, in meaning, very blurred and very close together. For instance, you have something like anxiety, but you have also anxiety and fear. You have phobia, you have being worried, and a lot of things which are very semantically very closely together, and which is also a challenge for translators, because sometimes you think that in your language it's just a synonym, anxiety and fear, and you cannot distinguish this clearly in your language. And unfortunately, those concepts completely miss whatsoever definition or reference to some standard. For instance, if you look into ICD-10, at least in the mental disorder chapter, you have very, very fine-grained definitions what an anxiety disorder is. Or another thing, which just I found out this afternoon, and really I made a very nice slide I called the lonely wheelchair. This is for the following. If you look at wheelchair, yeah, you have wheelchair device, but you have if you only look for the FSNs, you have 230 FSNs with wheelchair. But if you really, for instance, fall from the wheelchair, etc., and but if you then look how they are connected to wheelchair, it's very disappointing, because you have a wheelchair device. And of course, it has some descendants, but if you look wheelchair device references, you have only 2 other wheelchair concepts which have a relationship to this important wheelchair device concept, which I would say is very insufficient. And here is really a place where, let's say, the web of SNOMED could be woven more tightly. Yeah, so let me wrap it up, and I'm sorry that I haven't shown you some of the very nice slides I made, and I'm afraid they are lost forever, but still is fresh in my mind, so I could recreate them when I need. But to sum up, some important take-home messages is, yes, SNOMED is a very important and interesting resource for clinical NLP, especially the internal wiring of SNOMED. All those axioms could be really supportive for language understanding tasks, but you have to be aware that the language your clinicians talk and write is very, very different from the official labels and even synonyms, many synonyms in SNOMED. So really that you have to do a lot of resource engineering, and that, of course, some of the current techniques of neural networks, for instance, for finding similar expressions, doing some kind of fuzzy matching, could be important and should be exploited, but also should be validated for named entity normalization, but it nevertheless will not do the job for you. So that means if you really want to do large-scale clinical language understanding, you need to do a lot of terminology maintenance, but also maintenance, because it also it grows. Imagine 3 years ago nobody had used the word COVID, for instance. Okay, that's it, and I'm happy to answer some questions. And once again, apologies that I lost my slides. If I find them, I will post them on my website.
Oh, Dr. Schulz, no, don't apologize, because I have to tell you, even though like we didn't have the grand slides that you had worked on, and I'm sure they were lovely, I have to say this was essentially like an advanced graduate level seminar. Like that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And it looks like the Snomid CT community is also highly inspired because we have a large number of questions and comments and points for discussion in the Q&A box. So I will just jump right in. So the first one,
by the way, I will be available for longer time, so no problem. So
excellent.
Yeah.
That sounds wonderful.
Make up for the mischief.
Yeah. You're awesome. Thank you. And so community, just to know that we will probably go a little bit longer just because we have so many awesome questions. But feel free to jump off if you have to, just because I know everyone is always booked right up to the hour with all meetings now on Zoom and everything. However, as a reminder, we will be posting the full video and everything online afterwards. So if you do have to pop off, we will have that. So I will jump into the Q&A first. First comment, informational comment is actually from Nikki Ingram from Snomid International. Hi, Nikki. She says, for information, for the July release and using the batch automation, we have now updated the terming secondary malignancy in disorders to metastatic. So that's good.
This is good, but on the other hand, as I said, that even the clinicians, they use other ways, and especially with cancer, it's incredible. For instance, I found out that here in Austria, many clinicians, in order to write that something is malignant, they just put a minus sign next to the anatomy term.
Yeah.
Or N dot, which means neoplasia. But N dot also means nerve and things like that.
I was going to say, and it's going to exactly.
But I think that Snomid International really should not spend too much resources into synonyms. Also, the national release centers. I'm in the German language. That means Germany, Austria, and Switzerland translation group, and it's really if you cannot reach high coverage, and I think ideally it should be a community effort. So if really there is a large community of Snomid users in a language group, perhaps using some crowdsourcing mechanism could be helpful to harvest more synonyms.
Excellent point. Next question is from Abdul Mateen. Are you using English Snomid CT to mine German clinical notes? I didn't get how you were using making use of English Snomid CT, or if you were using the German translation of Snomid CT. So just
there is no German translation. I never called it Snomid its translation, because it's not a translation. It's a map. Yeah, a map of a collection of common German terms, yeah, like N. coli, which means neoplasia of colon, for instance, and using this map, and this effort is I started 7 years ago, and I have sometimes had some funding, but not that much. But with the help of students who do this work quite well, they like doing it, because for them it's a constant refreshing of the medical knowledge. So I really have come up to a couple of million of terms, because the longer terms are machine generated, and of course you get a lot of permutations, therefore it really may explode sometimes. And using that, the coverage is comparable to English when using the benchmark, the so-called SSCT benchmark, which is a parallel corpus in 5 languages with Snomid annotations.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Dr. Mark Banks from Snomid International. If you're adding the closest finding site to any finding or disorder, regardless of sentence structure, which is not encoded, modeled with a different finding site, such as ulcer, are you worried about the potential to add finding sites to disorder incorrectly? How common do you think it would be for that suspected ulcer would only be documented once and not repeated with further finding site context elsewhere in the patient record?
Yeah, this is up to experimentation. Yeah. For instance, the complete sentence I had prepared was the wall of the pylorus and the proximal duodenum was thickened, yeah, in the CT, and therefore possible ulcer. So in this case, you have two reference, yeah, you have two anatomical sites, and the term ulcer should be refined twice, one to duodenal ulcer and once to ulcer of the pylorus. Yeah. And so this is really, this is up to experimentation. And the baseline would be just take the first anatomy concept to the left. Yeah. And this would be the baseline, and what then would be tested against that would be relation assertions from language models trained with a corpus, with a training corpus in which there were manually asserted finding site relations between conditions and body parts. Yeah, this is a PhD student of mine is planning, and okay. I hope
that's what I was going to ask, if you were going to test that. Okay, that'd be interesting.
The problem is that for that we need to create our own benchmark. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And also perhaps our own training data, and that is then a resource problem. But I'm also involved in a future project which has last week been approved in Germany, in which I also participate via my German affiliation. And this is a huge project, I think 4 or 5 million euro, with the only goal to create annotated clinical and shareable clinical corpora. And so this would be a great resource for the German language group. But of course, every language would have to create something on their own, which is really resource intensive.
Absolutely. Mark, just put something in the chat box if you had additional comment. Oh, there, I know Mark. He follows up with a limit on which sites are allowable in that greeting match depend on the core concept sounds reasonable or sounds sensible. Look forward to hearing the outcomes of that research.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we all do. Yes, we all do. Next one comes from, Warren. Hi, Warren. Warren is a previous presenter at the Snomed CT research webinar. Welcome back, Warren. He says, hi, Stefan. Thank you for the talk. I'm a research associate at the University of Manchester. Our group is currently working on mapping free text diagnoses in outpatient letters to Snomid CT. So this topic is very interesting, and he would love to chat with you about this at some point.
Yeah,
has a question.
Well, welcome.
I'll do a virtual connection.
Yeah, on the last slide, I had put my email address, but I think it's also in the flyer. So yeah,
I can also do an
email,
virtual,
and then we can also set up a video call. Yeah.
He does have a question. Warren asks, do you think content extraction, he has a correction. Do you think content extraction methods might be useful in this context? On the terminology side, ref set, reference set, curation, but also on the ontology side, methods such as modularization and or subontology extraction, thinking in terms of constraining the terminology and ontology to a domain of interest. For example, rheumatological diagnoses. It might also be useful for semi-automatic excluding irrelevant codes or making the process of human annotation a bit easier.
Yeah, I think yes and no. Yes, if you really know what you are looking for. For instance, if you are not really, if you are in rheumatology and you are only interested in rheumatology medication, then okay, but rheumatology patients often have other diseases and may take other drugs, and there may perhaps be a problem of drug interaction. And then unfortunately, this content is not in the module you had carved out. So I think there are pros and cons, but clearly the analysis of a sample of narratives is a very good way for scoping and for then cutting out a piece of SNOMED so that perhaps you prevent some of the problems like, annotating liver transplant with a tropical pathogen. Yeah, this would probably not be then in such a module.
Yeah, excellent point. I mean, that is something that always comes up whenever we start to talk about, modularization, fragmenting, or these subontologies. And Warren, I should have known that you were going to bring in subontologies and modularization in there. But excellent points. While it might facilitate and assist with some implementation, you definitely do risk that losing of additional contextual information, especially for those patients with the comorbidities and such. So he does have a follow-up question. Could you point to some open resources on the annotation guidelines you mentioned? We are currently constructing these for the purposes described, but any existing work in this direction would be of interest.
The only thing is what I shortly mentioned, where we had those multilingual annotators annotate a parallel corpus with that rather disappointing inter-annotator agreement. There are two papers. I think in one of these papers, I can send the links. There is the annotation guideline in the annex, but I would not really reuse this. I think at that time it was a short EU project. We were under extreme time pressure. The purpose of all was to assess the suitability of the introduction of Snomid CT in EU countries, and therefore we looked at things like that, but not with enough time, unfortunately, and therefore the annotation guideline is not what I would really like to propagate. So I can easily share the annotation guideline I have. It is a Google document, and I can grant access for writing, for reading and commenting for whoever wants. Just send me an email. But it's work in progress. But of course, it would be great if you could discuss some points, and it will be published probably just as a guideline. And if somebody contributes from another language group, even better. So.
Awesome. I will say that we do have a couple of others who have also asked for links or advice on the publicly available annotation guidelines. One from Matthias Bruneck, and looks like Clyde Collins also made a comment about good libraries of pre-trained models for span relation extraction to be mapped to Snomid CT terms. So what I'm going to suggest for those who are seeking additional links and want to see this, the annotated guidelines, go ahead and email me, sro@snomed.org, and I'll extend all of those virtual.
Yeah, really very good if there are other annotation guidelines. Particularly, I would be interested in annotation guidelines, which also encompass FIRE. Perhaps also annotation guidelines, SNOMED, FIRE, and LOINC, perhaps. Yeah, RX norm is perhaps also some annotation activities very important, but it's really restricted to the US because it's not used. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so go ahead, those online, and email me, and I'll extend that, virtual introduction so you can all connect on that one. Another one from IMS. Hi, Stefan. Thank you for sharing. These are so many points that I keep nodding my head to when it comes to clinical notes documentation. I was wondering if you have looked into word embedding utilizing Snomid CT ontology and how this ties to clinical word embedding trained on formal biomedical literature and clinical notes.
Yeah, this is a good question, and definitely. I'm convinced that a pre-trained model on, let's say, on the same domain, but perhaps with other language preferences, is much better than nothing. But nevertheless, it's I think it's still subject to research. We have done done some initial tests with such models, and often we were not that satisfied that, for instance, from such a pre-trained model, you should, for instance, expect something that, let's say, low weight newborn and low weight baby or something is very, very close, but it wasn't that clear. But we are really still learning. Yeah, so I cannot really answer this question. But just an information, it's so crazy. Now my presentation popped up here, so I can share it. But this is so strange. Yeah.
It went into the void for a little bit.
It showed up as a conflicted copy. There was some synchronization problem, and now at least, yeah. I think it's really, I knew there's a problem with this, our next cloud, so it was probably, it had probably half digested this document and then that stopped. And now it came up, it's funny, but it's good because I can share it. Yeah, I will send it to you immediately, and I have lost all that work.
Before you lose it again.
I'm happy that I did it this afternoon, so it was very fresh in my mind, and so I could more or less improvise the whole seminar.
It totally works. Yeah, you said that, and as I mentioned, usually takes us a couple of days to get the video prepared and uploaded onto YouTube, and we always make the slides available in addition to the video recording. So
of course,
make sure it's all available for everyone.
I could do another recording, but this could be perhaps if you have time and if you just give me a session next week or whenever, and I just do the same with this new slide deck, then we would have an additional version which is really then fancier.
Yeah,
but maybe it's even too long, but this is not a problem when it's a recorded session. So
I was gonna say, don't want to lose these great questions.
I will send it to you, and if you think it makes sense, then we can just have another session, just you and me, and you start it and push the button and then forget it, and then save it as a recorded session. I think it would be better than this.
We'll have two for this month. Absolutely, you and I can work offline on we can record that. Looking at the time, it looks like we have a couple more questions. Are you wanting to?
I'm available.
Okay, we'll get through these and we'll wrap up for today. So from John Schneider from the NLM, to what degree is artificial intelligence like Google's LAMDA, sorry, I'm not familiar with that one, influencing natural language processing, or are the limitations of NLP tools and ontology limitations preventing artificial intelligence projects from progressing?
Yeah. Did I understand the second thing, that there is that he sees a kind of competition between ontology and machine learning, which I would not see. I would see this is really, it should complement each other. Yeah, and of course, Google has regardless of the tools and the formalisms, Google has an advantage which is not really relevant for clinical text mining. It has the advantage that they have trillions of documents in all languages about all domains minus the clinical domain. Yeah. And well, I know of a project which with Google where really there was also somebody could use the whole machinery or server farm with a lot of graphical processors in order to train a deep learning model. I think a bird model also with. But it wasn't. It should be. It was planned to be clinical stuff. But then it. Yeah, now I remember it. It really didn't turn out because there was. It's not a protected environment. So of course, Google, as soon as Google deploys this machinery, which also includes a lot of hardware, and then, for instance, inside a hospital with 5 million discharge summaries, yeah, you could train a model. Definitely, it will be good once the ethical and legal aspects are solved. But then it's a resource for that hospital. I'm quite sure that a large HMOs in the US, like Mayo Clinic, they are actually doing this. I'm quite sure. But well, for research which means really comparing data and results, it's of course not that usable because it has to be inside. Yeah. But well, I have to confess, my background is ontology and let's say more formal methods, symbolic methods, and I'm, along with many other people, now trying to get also into the neural domain, well, step by step, but I'm really not an expert here. So I should not give an answer which is not very well found.
And last question comes from Christian Kennecken. I'm sorry, Christian, if I totally butchered your last name. You brought up Rector's work on models, excuse me, models of usage and models of meaning as magnificent work. Rector and Brandt 2008 wrote about also using the situation with explicit context throughout the Snomed CT. Have you any reflections on this idea and why it has not been implemented? Some of the useful benefits would be a uniform structure for context and negation. I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, but the problem with this situation hierarchy is that if you use it then for reasoning, you get wrong results, because, for instance, absence. Let's assume something like, for instance, presence of diabetes mellitus implies presence of endocrine disorder. But absence of diabetes mellitus does not imply absence of endocrine disorder, because you could not have diabetes, but you could have hyperthyroidism or something like that. So the big problem with negation is that SNOMED's description logics profile does not include negation. And so if you then put the meaning of negation into the terms, or having something like absence or absence of, then you use logic-based reasoning, then you get wrong results. And therefore, I feel more comfortable doing this in another formalism which does not have this very strict description logic semantics. And this is the case with fire, that I do the negation in fire, and that I do not use negated concepts or contextualized concepts like suspected something. Yeah, of course, sometimes, especially in languages like, for instance, German or perhaps Dutch, where sometimes the negation particle is glued together with another particle, and then the whole word already includes negation. And you want to find a code for this word, and then you need, or an expression for this code, and then you may want to use the context model. The ideal thing is to create some kind of bridge between the context model and fire. Another thing which I remember, it was discussed at the fire meeting in London, at the London meeting in April, the SNOMED meeting, that it was also criticized that the value sets in fire are often very, very small. And especially regarding things like suspected, diagnosis, provisional, excluded, differential, and so on. SNOMED offers much more different concepts than HL7. But nevertheless, you could use, let's say, the skeleton of HL7 fire, and nevertheless use SNOMED concepts instead of the fire value set.
Excellent. All right. With that, I will go ahead and start to wrap up for today. Dr. Schulz and Snomid CT community, thank you so much for attending today. It was, not exactly what some of us had anticipated. However, Dr. Schulz, it was excellent. So thank you very much. We will work on if we're going to do a re-recording. So as long as you have registered, and if you are here, you obviously have, I will email everyone with an update and either link or links to videos and slides. And thank you so much for attending and participating, and we will see you all next time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. And well, I will send you slides. You can publish them, and we can really record the real session whenever you want.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
And see you next
Bye-bye.
time.